Peace and blessings, everyone. Welcome to Spotlight. I'm Edjuenka, and we have a very informative program for you tonight. As you may know, the Caribbean community has been trying to unite for many years now with limited success. The latest attempt has been to develop a single market and economy. The Virgin Islands have its own issues, its own national issues with these developments, whether the single market and economy is in the Virgin Islands' best interest. One other is the free movement of Caribbean people in and around the Caribbean, and particularly in and around the BVI, despite the fact that we are known for having perhaps more variety of Caribbean people than any place else. So, but those are some of the issues from a social, economic, political standpoint. And I have with me a very special guest this evening, HLSCC lecturer, Mrs. Dana Lewis Ambrose. She just recently published a paper in a Chinese Business Review, sounds like a big deal, Business Review, on the topic, the relevance of Caribbean, the relevance of CARICOM to the existence of the Virgin Islands in the context of globalization. Let me say it again. The relevance of CARICOM to the existence of the Virgin Islands in the context of globalization. And tonight we're going to be discussing that topic. So you keep it locked right here to Spotlight. We're going to take a word from our sponsors, and when we come back, we're going to have a really, really good discussion. Be right back after these words.
This program is sponsored by the law firm of J.S. Archibald & Co. and by the trust company J.S. Archibald Trust Services Limited, both of Roadtown, Tortola, BVI.
Welcome back to Spotlight. I want to tell you to give your friends a call, those that don't have cable, or don't have a television. They can see us streaming live on jtvlive.net. So you can tell them they can tune in on their computers and get in on this great discussion. Of course, you're going to have an opportunity to question Ms. Lewis Ambrose about her paper and her research. She's done a tremendous amount of research to put this paper together. I want to welcome you, Dana and Ambrose, Lewis Ambrose, to Spotlight.
Thank you.
Good. Are you becoming a regular? Now I'm going to make you a co-host.
I somehow will decline right now.
Yeah, decline right now.
I have a lot of work on my hands. So
before I get into the paper, the publication, the World 2012 conference is coming up. How is that going? Quickly.
Plans are going pretty well for that conference. We've been releasing press releases as often as we possibly can. The reason for releasing the press releases is to keep the local public updated, as well as the international delegates that we expect to be arriving here in May. We've received over 140 entries for the concurrent sessions. We have pretty much confirmed the majority of the keynotes at this point, so anyone who's interested in having an idea of who those very special and important people are, you can log on to the website for the conference.
Yeah, you got some big names. Talk to us about some of the big names you got coming.
Yes, we have the Minister for Sustainable Development, Energy, Technology, Science, Dr. James Fletcher. He's from St. Lucia, and he will be giving the opening keynote on the Tuesday morning. His topic will be education, youth, and society within small islands. He's the former OECS Social Policy Director, so he has quite a lot of experience dealing with social issues and education, etc.
And then you got Dr. Rav Gonzalez.
Yes, he's so we have
one of my favorite Caribbean
we have
leaders.
Dr. James Fletcher opening, and we have Dr. Ralph Gonzalez closing. He's going to be doing the last keynote. So we have two heavy hitters
in the beginning and the end.
at the beginning and the end, and we have heavy hitters
In between
as well, because we have Wendy Fitzwilliams. She's a former Universe pageant winner.
Yes.
And we also have Elizabeth Thompson. She's the Assistant General Secretary of the United Nations. And we also have Governor Dwight Venner. He's the ECCB,
the Caribbean
Development Banks. He's the governor of the Caribbean Development Bank. He will be sitting in on a panel with some other very distinguished speakers, including Robert Mactavius from the BVI. So we have quite
a lot of heavy hitters.
Yeah, we have heavy hitters.
Great information,
great dialogue. I don't see why anyone should miss it for the world.
And tell us when it's happening again.
It's happening the 29th of May to the 1st of June 2012. Let me also add that we have a youth forum package within that conference as well. So we will also be targeting the youth and getting them engaged in discussions among themselves as well. So we're trying to make sure that we have something for every single person.
Well, it certainly sounds like something that the Virgin Islands is going to be proud of at the end of the day.
Yes.
Well, congratulations on being published in the Chinese Business Review.
Yes.
That sounds like a big deal, is it?
Well, for me, it's nothing major.
I mean, I know you get published all the time. You get your stuff around all the time. I mean, you do a lot of research and a lot of writing, seeing that that's what you like.
Yes.
Yeah. But to be in the Chinese Business Review, I think sounds impressive.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. How something like that happen? You just submit the paper?
Actually, they contacted me. Let me just give a little history about the paper and everything. This paper is actually a product of the Islands of the World Conference.
Okay.
And I would have presented it there. I usually like to present my work before I try to get it published. That way you can get feedback from other experts in that particular area and be able to improve on the writings and the different perspectives that you put into the paper itself. So I was able to have that done, and lo and behold, I got an email out of the blue from the Chinese Business Review saying they're interested in publishing the paper. And that's where it began, and we are now here. Let me also say, though, that this paper is actually part one. There's a part two. How did that come about? The initial research was to look at the Economic Partnership Agreement. And when I approached the various persons who would have participated in this research project, it was realized during the interviews and discussions that you could take different perspectives and directions for a paper of that nature, because you could not discuss the Economic Partnership Agreement without talking about CARICOM and its historical glitches. All right, so I tried to put together the paper, but then I realized it was too many issues being dealt with at the same time. So then taking advice from other persons, because you let people review your work, that's how you're able to improve on it. I decided to divide the paper in two. So the first paper, as you would have said, which is this paper, looks at the relevance of CARICOM's existence to the Virgin Islands in the context of globalization. And then the second paper is going to look at the Virgin Islands' perspective of the Economic Partnership Agreement and what would have gone right, what would have gone wrong with regards to the negotiations of that entire exercise.
Make us clearer on the economic partnership agreement. Is that agreement with the European Union?
Yes, that's
and the Caribbean.
Yeah, that's well, not only the Caribbean, also the African Caribbean Pacific states. It was a huge agreement that replaced past agreements that the Caribbean and the African states would have had, because they would have had these special agreements between them and the European Union, which then, or you could say Europe for that matter. If you really think about it holistically, that's where the whole concept of globalization comes in, because when you had the World Trade Organization stepping in and bringing in these rules based on NAFTA and GATT and all these different things that they would have created, what that actually did is said, okay, we can't have these preferential agreements between the Caribbean, because that's why the Caribbean did so well with selling its sugar for all of those years before. And so when those agreements came into place, it said, no, you have to have even footing across the board. And what that then did,
level playing field.
Level playing field, yeah. And what that then did is put the Caribbean at a disadvantage. So this was like opportunity for them to again have an agreement, specifically now with the European Union. I wouldn't say it's a necessary preferential treatment, but it's like, okay, you're bringing your perspectives, or your what you're looking for, what you're looking to get out of trade and so on to the table, as well as the European Union. They would have been bringing what they wanted to get out of the agreement. At the end of the day, I could say that I think the Caribbean did not benefit. Well, the agreement's already in place, but they did not take advantage of the opportunity. And if we go through the paper, or this paper, you'll see hints to why that may have happened, hence why this paper is relevant, because CARICOM itself has had multiple issues when it comes to going together and negotiating.
Problems with unity.
Yeah, negotiating as a forum.
Yeah. I don't want to get too far ahead.
Yeah.
But and I want the listening or the viewing audience to get some definitions before we get too deep into the discussion. So when you talk about in the context of globalization, I know we have a concept in our mind about what we think globalization is,
right.
But tell us what globalization is from your perspective and from your research perspective.
Well, globalization
in a social, economic, and political
a wide
context.
topic, and there are many authors who've written on it. One author would say that it's the removal of boundaries. Removal of boundaries, meaning that everyone gets to express themselves openly, and it therefore removes, not intentionally, but it removes identities, whether you look at it from a cultural perspective or a social perspective or even an economic perspective. So when you remove those boundaries, what you have is an open playing field, as I would have alluded to before. And you don't have these identities where you could hold on to nationalism, or you could hold on to this is where what our culture is.
I'm preserving this for my people.
And so on. So globalization erases those
so companies can go all over the world and establish themselves regardless of what the laws are in the country, or the laws have to be conformed into the global context.
Let's just put it this way. I would make the argument globalization is not a new phenomenon. It is not. People have been moving from one part of the world to the next for centuries. I mean, if you think about it, put it in the context of slavery, I mean, that's really and truly what it was. And when the slaves would have come, or when they would have gone to wherever they would settle, they carried their culture, they carried their ideas, of course.
But this is more economic based, though.
Yeah.
This is
well, even the slave trade in itself had economic benefits and so on. But what I'm saying is that globalization means that there's no limits, there's no restriction
on trade.
There's no restrictions on even social expressions. If you think about it, I would say the internet in itself is a product of globalization.
But how does that bode for small island states or the Caribbean region? Then you talk about being able to trade across boundaries, across national boundaries, and do away with nationalism. Doesn't that give the developed world an unfair advantage and put us, the developing world, or put us, the small islands particularly, at a severe disadvantage?
Of course, because you're small, meaning your size. So globalization, meaning having quicker access to other things, or quicker access to all types of information, all types of resources, and so on and so forth. If you don't have the resources, if you don't have the ability to negotiate or to participate in the economic activity or whatever activity is taking place, then obviously you will be at a disadvantage. And regrettably, small islands tend to fit into that category, where they have limited resources, limited scope, and their size just puts them at a disadvantage. But I would also say that while the size is a disadvantage, it can also be an advantage. But you have to be able to identify or recognize what the advantages are to your smallness and being able to benefit from the entire system.
It seems, though, that while the developed countries are talking about globalization, they in fact have been practicing nationalism.
Of course.
And particularly, you mentioned NAFTA, with the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Yes.
With there's a Canada, United States, and Mexico. That is anti-globalization, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't that agreement?
Because
but it was allowed, the World Trade Organization allowed it to stand.
Yeah, because who was involved? The United States, Canada.
So then it's not really,
those are two big headers.
But this is the point. This is the point I'm making, that the developed countries, it seems to me, right, that the developed countries came up with a scheme called globalization to be able to sell its products all over the world in such a way that the rest of the world would not be able to compete, and take the resources that they need from the rest of the world. And in essence, the developed countries, which happens to be 90% or 80% of people of color, become a market and employees.
But I would also say that you've actually seen somewhat of the reverse occur, because now you have China being, which would have been, well, it's not small, but it would have been a developing country, still is. But you see now those countries taking the rules of globalization and playing them against the heavy hitters, which is why
things are backfiring.
Yeah, because you have India taking off, you have Brazil taking off, you have China taking off, and they can't stop it. they can't stop it.
Okay, we got to take a break. And I wanted to come back and talk about these various organizations, CARICOM and the Association of Caribbean, African Caribbean Pacific States, the European Union, OECS.
Yes.
All these various groupings of countries, they anti-globalization as well. And to have these regional groupings and international groupings, it's that in itself, one being regionalist, one being internationalist, and they themselves anti-globalization and the whole hypocrisy of the globalization movement and the rise of nationalism again. We can take a break and come back and try to get a whole of that whole big topic there. Okay. Keep it locked right here, the Spotlight. We'll be right back.
Spotlight is brought to you by CCT Global Communication, DataPro, Orion Law, Clarence Thomas Limited, Virgin Island Motors, and Bolo's Wholesale Cash and Carry.
Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm here with lecturer from HLSCC, Mrs. Dana Lewis Ambrose, and we're talking about how relevant is CARICOM to the Virgin Islands in a global context. We left off talking about all these groupings. You know, we talk about globalization. We talk about the doing away with national boundaries. But you have now all these agreements with each little bloc. You know, the European Union got their own bloc. North America got their own bloc. The Caribbean's got their own bloc. Even within the Caribbean, you have two blocks: the Eastern Caribbean and the broader Caribbean. How relevant are these things in the global context? Are these groupings in the global context? What are they shaped to do? What are they formed to do?
I think what people have come to recognize is that when you are negotiating, you have more power in numbers. And that is why these groupings have significantly increased over the years, because they recognize that perhaps if they attempt to negotiate or go into agreements singly, yes, they will have benefits, but perhaps they might be able to have greater potential or greater possibilities if they group together. Well, I can say that for the OECS and CARICOM, because that is one of the objectives within their formation, for small islands to come together and to be able to negotiate and to, because if you really think about it, they share ideals and they have commonalities. I would assume also that the European Union, being made up of European countries, they would have also shared ideals and have had commonalities, and so it would have benefited them to come together. They came together and they were able to create their own currency as well. Of course, we still have some nations like UK not using that, but the euro has found its identity. I mean, initially it would have struggled. Then it was performing very well, and then we had the disaster of Greece, and that was the end of the story with that. But they still have been doing pretty well despite the troubles of some of the European countries. And I must say that perhaps even if you didn't have a European Union, maybe Greece would have been in a worse position, because it would not have had partners to work with in trying to get them out of their debt crisis. So if you look at it from that perspective, being associated with a grouping had benefits for a country like Greece. And a European Union would have had a stronger ability to negotiate with the IMF than if Greece had gone to the IMF itself.
But those are unified groups.
Right.
Now, CARICOM, however, seems to be a group that can't get itself together. and you mentioned the European Partnership Agreement. For a while, you had several Caribbean countries who did not want to sign, Guyana being one, the leader, who did not want to sign the agreement, who thought more time should have been taken to review it and to see whether it was in the Caribbean's best interest. And then you had a virtual split, and I guess Guyana then had to come in and sign. So, is it working for us? Is CARICOM working?
I would say that every thing that you create has its issues. CARICOM has its benefits, and that's one of the things that was actually revealed in the paper from discussing with the various interviewees. It has its benefits.
Talk to us about those benefits.
For example, University of the West Indies is a product of CARICOM, believe it or not. UE has its issues as well, but UE has graduated many of the prime ministers throughout the region right now. And many of the successful business persons, successful lawyers, successful doctors. So UE has actually done what it was intended to do. It now has to go through a stage of moving to the next level, which is being able to compete now with being able to bring classes to persons online and so on. And they are going through that phase. It's a teething stage, but they will also get to master that as well.
And I think you might add that in the Virgin Islands, I would say a good portion of the Virgin Islands leadership graduated from the University of the West Indies.
So that is one of the...
That's one impact.
Yeah, that's one of the main benefits.
But when it comes to the economic benefits, CARICOM seem to be having challenges in terms of a single market and economy, cultural interchange, movement of people. How important is culture? What role does culture play in that in CARICOM's ability to unite the Caribbean?
Culture plays a particularly important role because each island, culture is what defines each island, believe it or not. The people, how you do things, the way you speak, the way you interact, that defines who you are. So when you have an organization coming together, you find somehow that culture becomes more, I would say, murkied or starts to lose its definity. All right, but I will also make an argument to say that many of the cultures have similarities already, and so there's this fear of losing your identity doesn't need to be necessarily there because there's similarities within the cultures already. And I just think that what people have to recognize is that you have similarities, you have differences. There doesn't need to be a tug of war to say that we want to be definitively different. I'll give you an example. There's a local dish here which is called fungi, right? It's made from cornmeal with okra or sometimes spinach, or sometimes it's done with no real additives. In Barbados, you prepare the same thing, but you call it cuckoo. Now, cuckoo means something else here, right? In Trinidad, they also do cuckoo as well. So what I'm saying is that I'm sure that if you go down the chain of the islands, you'll recognize that there are other people who prepare cornmeal dishes. There might be slight differences, but the same concept is there. And I'm just saying that that is a similarity that can be celebrated, right? and you can therefore be able to share that opportunity, because yes, the fungi is prepared that way, but then you may put something different with it. Like, for example, in Barbados you use flying fish. In the BVI you might use a pot fish, and so that's where the differences come in.
So particularly in the English-speaking Caribbean, the similarities in culture is far greater than the uniqueness.
I would say, I would make a major argument and say, yeah. I mean, there's certain things that are definitive to certain territories. Like, in Jamaica, they love the reggae. So,
and that's their creation.
And that is their creation. But the Caribbean, if you think about it, celebrates reggae.
Right.
You hear reggae. I mean, Bob Marley was the person who actually made reggae international.
Yeah.
And reggae is one of the positive benefits of the Caribbean as well.
We got to take a break, and we're going to come back and continue the discussion right after this. Keep it locked right at the Spotlight.
This program is sponsored by the law firm of J.S. Archibald & Co. and by the trust company J.S. Archibald Trust Services Limited, both of Rotown, Tortola, BVI.
Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm Edgewenk. I'm here with lecturer Dana Lewis Ambrose from Age Liberty South Community College, and we're talking about her paper. The topic is CARICOM relevant to the Virgin Islands in a global context. And we were talking about culture, and I think you were suggesting that the culture is more or less the same with perhaps subtle peculiarities.
Yes.
At best, right? And in your paper, you also seem to be, for lack of a better word, putting the fault or blaming the leadership in the Caribbean for trying to hold on to their individual power and sacrificing unity in order to do that.
If you really look back at it historically, we are now in 2012. If you look at the Caribbean leadership that was in existence before 2006, you recognize that it would have been very different from the Caribbean leadership that was in existence between, let's say, 2006 and 2011. But something significant happened, and I would say this, that after 2006, you had a series of elections that swept through the Caribbean, and the people of the Caribbean changed the leadership. The leadership that existed between 2006 was pro-CARICOM. Right? You had your P.J. Pattersons, your Owen Arthurs, your, what's the guy's name from Trinidad? I can't remember his name.
Not Manning.
Yeah, Manning. Manning. Yeah, he was there. And most of these individuals were moving CARICOM in a good level speed.
And you had Jack Deal
from Guyana. Of course, he was pro-CARICOM as well. And then after 2006, you had a series of elections where you saw new leadership emerging. And I would say that CARICOM really started to hemorrhage after 2006.
So the new leadership was against...
I'm not saying they were totally against it, but it was like almost every single island or territory had a new leader. And when they came together, it seemed as if everyone was looking for, okay, what can I get out of this grouping.
What is CARICOM going to do for me?
Yeah. In other words, rather than looking at it for what we can do for CARICOM, it was what can we do together, or what we can do together. Yes, what can they were looking at it from what can CARICOM do for me, and within that period is where you had the lengthy negotiations again with the economic partnership agreement.
But you're blaming the developed countries in your paper for the inability of the Caribbean leaders to unite. When you say, when you talk about in your paper the divide and conquer techniques of the developing world.
Yeah, and that was suggested. Of course, that would have played a role in it, but I would I would put more blame on the Caribbean leadership itself, because you've gone through various relationships with these countries and these groupings. This is not the first time that the Caribbean had to negotiate with Europe, and it would not have been the first time they would have had to negotiate collectively with any of the other larger countries as well. So if they fell to the trick of divide and conquer, I blame them.
Right.
I blame them, because history is there, history is written. If you allow history to continue to repeat itself, there's no one to point the finger to but yourself. All right. So yes, the divide and conquer techniques were there, and you can't blame. Well, you can say yes, they were applied, but you can't overall say, well, or you can't say, how I would put it, you can't necessarily say that they were not smart to do it. If you can do something,
well,
and you can get away from it,
they're looking out for their own interests.
You can get away with it.
Yeah, they're looking out for their own interests.
Yeah.
So if that technique has worked in the past and it continues to work, then
right.
go for it.
So that's why I say that I would blame the Caribbean leadership, and not necessarily so much the developed world, because they're only looking out for their best interests.
The Virgin Islands feels that it has made significant progress over the years. And I think it's fair to say, or it appears to be, I should say then, that the other Caribbean countries perhaps that was successful in the past, they're not having that success that the Virgin Islands is having now. And so the Virgin Islands association with CARICOM perhaps is not, or at least some of the tenets of CARICOM is not desirable at this time. Is that the sense that you've gotten and from your investigation?
I think generally the Virgin Islands prefers to wait and see. Not that they don't have any good intentions for CARICOM, or not that they do not believe CARICOM has its merits, but there's still some kinks within CARICOM, major kinks that need to be ironed out. And so until those kinks are ironed out, they will continue to just be associated and not be enshrined within the workings of CARICOM. And you can't blame them, because look at an organization like CCJ, Caribbean Court of Justice. Even full members of CARICOM have not signed on to that. So you can't really get upset with the Virgin Islands if it decides to wait and see. It makes sense, because CARICOM itself, the full membership of CARICOM, are still working out their issues. I think what would have been recommended from the paper, based on the interviews I would have done, there seems to be two things that need to be done. And the first thing that needs to be done is a dialogue with all the members, whether associate or full members, and try to sit down and figure out what is the intention of CSME how can it work for everyone, whether you are a member, a full member, or associate member. That's one of the first issues that CARICOM has to really address.
Well, while you're on that issue, and before you get to the others, let's discuss it. What benefit would a single market, a Caribbean single market, and economy have for the Virgin Islands? We don't export anything,
right?
Well, we export tourism and financial services. Given those two exports, what would be the benefits?
Let me make one very obvious well, you might not see it as a benefit, but you have an opportunity to be involved in trade. Right now, the BVI imports a significant amount of its consumption. All right.
Virtually all its consumption.
Yeah, yes. Virtually all of its consumption. But I will dare to say that you can question the standard or the quality of what you're importing. I'm not saying that they did anything to create a scare.
So we could get a better quality of produce and livestock and poultry and meats and so on from the Caribbean.
Within the Caribbean, I would imagine that there's less use of pesticides and hormones and so on that you would get from other countries whose agenda is to push production, get it out there as fast as possible, and
they have little concern for health and quality issues.
Yeah. Well, of course, they have certain standards that they have to meet based on the ISO standards and so on.
But I noticed that you have on the labels now on some of these packaging that come from overseas for export only.
Yeah.
That scares me.
Of course, it has to scare you because then you have to question, okay, what's the difference? What's the difference between what is to be exported and what is to be consumed locally? And I would say to you this, my experience, if you look back at this whole when what was it? What's the name of it? These vehicles that what do you call it? Reconditioned. When this whole reconditioned vehicle phenomena came into play, I think it opened the eyes of the Caribbean, because reconditioned vehicles were cars that were made for the local market that were just updated and exported. And what people started to recognize is that these cars were older than the new cars that were being exported to the Caribbean and were performing better than some of the cars that were made specifically for the Caribbean to be exported to the Caribbean. And that is an example there in itself. They had more features, and they could stand up a lot longer.
So the quality of consumables would be one benefit from the Caribbean.
I think so.
Okay,
because
talk about another benefit.
Because
and I think it's a valid point.
Because
the ground produces.
Yeah, I don't say anyone can question. For example, you have a country like Dominica. That's what you would expect Dominica to perform well in, producing good ground provision food. So for me, that's an obvious benefit.
Another benefit.
I would say that there's an opportunity for exchange of for what you would say for entertainment or cultural exchange, for that matter. All right. You can make the argument. Whenever there's festival, you see a huge influx of Caribbean artists into the Virgin Islands. The question, the position can be made. Let's say to them, okay, you all want to bring the Caribbean artists here. Well, let the Virgin Island artists also go to the other Caribbean territories and participate in their regional festivals as well. So it gives your local artists exposure, and that's one of the underpinnings of CSME, that ability for artists to move more freely between boundaries, whether it be people singing or whether it be persons who paint, doing artistic work, and so on. So that's another benefit. It's just that you have to be able to pounce on it and say, look, we would like to have more cultural exchanges taking place, not letting it be one-sided, but you have to be able to push for that. If you're not pushing for it, that's what will happen.
And some other benefits, I mean, you're talking about cultural exchange, you're talking about produce, and in most of those instances, and I think this is where Virgin Islands are having issues, that both those examples that you use, the trade is a one-sided trade, where we import, we import the cultural events,
right.
We import foods and the consumables, but then what do we trade? And what do we trade in the Caribbean? So,
well,
except to say, forgive me if I'm interrupting, except to say, well, it's a Caribbean, and it's better that we buy our stuff from our own Caribbean brothers than to buy it from North America and Europe.
No, the opportunity for trade is going to be based on your strengths and weaknesses, and what it is that your economy actually engages in. As you would have mentioned before, the BVI promotes tourism and financial services, and so it's a service-oriented economy rather than a merchandise-based economy. So you would see there that goods coming in would more than likely overwhelm us than us being able to export any goods. But I would also then say that it is up to us to be able to know what we have and be able to create opportunities. For example, investment. Nobody really talks about investment as a potential opportunity for CSME, meaning other countries are allowing, private citizens are allowing businesses, for that matter, to invest in other islands.
So you see, for example, Clarence Thomas, or a Bolos or Vantapool's, opening up one of their businesses in St. Lucia.
As long as you've done the research and there's the market is there available, and you can compete with the current competitors, why not? That's another opportunity. Or even not necessarily opening a store, but what about a hotel? What happens within the region? We always seem to think that we have to have 5-star hotels that have to have quote unquote names that come from America or any other developed country. But you could create your own 4-star within the region. You could have a regional hotel chain. And you could have a shipping company within the region that transports the same goods that we've been talking about to
back and forth.
And what I'm saying is that the investment in that regional transportation shouldn't be limited to one particular country. It could be, you might say, well, Liat is not a good example, but an example is Liat. Liat has shares from various small islands. I mean,
and certainly a BVI airline could conceivably fly him back and forth to the Caribbean as well.
Yeah.
And giving Liat some competition and
you just need to be able to
people back and forth
negotiate
and compete.
And when you have these opportunities to meet with various heads or various persons within government, make these suggestions, make these proposals.
And the people in the various Caribbean countries, let me just ask the question this way, are the leaders in step with the people of the other Caribbean countries?
I don't think so.
You suggested referenda in the Caribbean to decide on CARICOM membership and
the reason
tenets.
why I suggested the referendum is because if you have a referendum and let's say the people say they don't want CARICOM, well then not CARICOM, they don't want CSME, then well, you know, to just squash the whole idea. It makes no sense going any further. But when you leave the decision up to the political leaders, then there's a lot of perception, there's a lot of power plays, there's a lot of political exchanges that you might interpret to be that this is the perspective of the region, not recognizing that politicians run in a 4 to 5 year cycle. And so if they find that something may threaten their ability to be re-elected, they don't necessarily go for it.
But you have a referendum without an educated public, for example, and shouldn't the politicians take the leadership role in persuading their constituencies that this is in their best interest and these are the benefits and this is what we need to be doing in order for us to have a better Caribbean? Shouldn't they be the ones looking at that and seeing that and having that?
And I would say before 2006 that was done, and there was some resistance from the general public because they were not educated properly. They did not see the overall benefits of CARICOM and CSME. So they were given little snippets of what people wanted them to know, or what, and you know what happens in the Caribbean or what happens in any of the islands. You hear one thing, it moves from here, it goes there, and then it becomes a whole chain effect. And so the negatives about CARICOM and CSME, they were touted. Not recognizing that with everything there are benefits and there are disadvantages.
It seemed like the new leadership in the Caribbean wanted to kill CARICOM. They don't want it to go ahead based on.
I would tell you that within the next next year to 2 years, you may see a whole set of new faces in the Caribbean again.
Okay, we got to take a break. But that would be interesting.
Yeah, I tell you that I suspect that. You already saw the effect in Jamaica, St. Lucia, and those were the persons who would have been in power before the 2006 period that I was talking about before.
You talked about extending CARICOM to the Americas, and I'm taking that to mean South America particularly. And we want to talk about that expansion and what would that mean in terms of strengthening CARICOM. We're going to be right back with more Spotlight, and you on the phones. We're going to open up the lines and the text lines when we come back. Hopefully you'll ask some questions and participate in the discussions. Keep it locked right here. We'll be right back.
Spotlight is brought to you by the National Bank of the Virgin Islands, Tortola Concrete Limited, Orion Law, Clarence Thomas Limited, Virgin Island Motors, and Bolo's Wholesale Cash and Carry.
Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm here with Dana Lewis Ambrose, and we're talking about CARICOM's relevance to the Virgin Islands, from a global perspective, a globalization perspective. The phone number is going to come up on the screen. You can call me or text me if you want to make a contribution to the discussion. You want to ask a question, make a comment. We'd be happy to hear from you. CARICOM expansion to include the Americas, and we already see places like Venezuela and Brazil and Nicaragua and other South American countries making some serious overtures, well, more than overtures, I mean, actually helping, in particular Venezuela, actually helping CARICOM with energy production and so on. and you seem to favor that expansion.
Well, that was really not my that was a recommendation that came out of the interviews, really.
Okay.
But I could see where that would have its advantages. I mean, the Americas, they have what you call numbers, meaning they have large populations, and they have resources. That's the one thing that's going for them, and so CARICOM being able to have relations with them, not necessarily expand to include them, but to have serious relationships with them, I don't see that as being a bad move or a step in the wrong direction, because you have connections with them in some way, because we're really close by.
We share the Caribbean Sea in many instances. Yes.
So that would be one advantage in terms of location, and other advantages, as I said, you would be able to carry numbers. And if you really think about it, I can't remember the exact year when President Obama came to Trinidad. He would have addressed the Americas, of which CARICOM technically is a part, and so they were able to discuss certain things at that particular grouping. But what we're saying is that perhaps that needs to be looked into more to see whether or not the group in itself can set up relations with each other to help move the Caribbean forward in terms of its ability to function and to be competitive against other developed markets and so on.
So is CARICOM relevant to the Virgin Islands?
I would make the argument and say yes, they're relevant, because the organization still has merits. However, as I said to you before, there's a lot of stuff that CARICOM has to work through, which is part of the concerns that the Virgin Islands would have, and I'm wanting to have that wait and see moment, or presently are in that wait and see moment. So yes, they're relevant, and I'll say they're relevant because of globalization. Because as the world moves forward, you see that everything is shrinking. Everything is being removed. And so these groupings that you would have talked about before, they're going to become much more relevant as time goes on.
You seem to suggest, or it was suggested in your paper, that nationalism is resurging.
Of course it is.
And on the rise. And global, that would suggest then that globalization is waning and not expanding.
The reason why nationalism is surging is because of globalization. Because people have become to realizing that globalization is not necessarily, it doesn't only have benefits, but it has disadvantages.
Are we beginning to think that the disadvantages are more than the advantages or the benefits? Do you think the world is beginning to think that? Places like Malaysia, for example, in your paper you refer to Malaysia not going the globalist path.
I think people
what did they see that the rest of us need to see?
The same things that we've been talking about before, which is the removal of boundaries and identities. Because if you don't know who you are, or where you're from, or what was the historical path that brought you to that point, if all of a sudden those things start to become irrelevant, then it brings the question, who are you really? It starts to question mark that. And if you think of it really, things like tourism, when tourists come to a place, That's the first thing they want to see. They want to see who are these people, what's their identity, what's their culture, what brought them to this point, the historical path, etc. So when you find that there are phenomena out there that blur these lines, you have to sometimes say, okay, here's where the buck stops, and I have to take responsibility of preserving my history, my culture, and my identity. And even though we may share similarities, we may share experiences, we still have to distinguish ourselves in order to be able to compete against each other.
So it sounds like you're saying that globalization is destined to fail, and it suggested in your paper that globalization might be seen around the world as a global capitalist state for the rich.
Technically, I think that may not would have been the intention, but that's what has come out of globalization. I don't think that globalization is a negative phenomena in itself, but the people that are able to exploit the phenomena make it negative and take advantage of the situations that bring them benefits. And so it's like exploitation, so to speak. You take advantage of what you're good at, and you just drown the entire world with that, and you forget that there are other countries that you need to engage with and be able to have relations with. But I'll tell you this, I think China in itself, they've been able to play the globalization card very well, because they've been able to restrict imports into their country. But if you check it very carefully, China invests a lot around the world. Well, and their investments come with conditions.
Well, I'm getting ready to ask you about the Caribbean's relationship with China. Quite a few Caribbean people seem to be having problems with that relationship, and you just said, and I just suspect that could be one of the challenges, that the investment comes with conditions.
Of course, it comes with conditions.
And there's been a significant growing Chinese investment in the Caribbean region, Dominica and other parts of the Caribbean. What's your views on that? Is that a good thing? Should we embrace China's desire to invest in the region?
I think you have to recognize that China has an objective. They really want to spread their wings as far as they possibly can. And when they invest, they don't just bring money, they bring people, right? And so you'll see a Chinese, as long as there's investment there, you'll see a small growing population of Chinese individuals.
But isn't that what Europeans, the North Americans do as well?
Of course they did it. But that's what I'm saying, that they've taken the globalization card and played it well.
But we see, I'm getting the sense from you, and not just you, but others that I have spoken with, and we seem to look at China as some new colonizer. But it seems like it's okay for North America and Europe to come into the Caribbean, bring their people, quote unquote invest, but China shouldn't have that same opportunity. And it seems to me that culturally, Caribbean people are more related to Asians than to North Americans and Europeans.
Expound on that.
Well, you got Chinese that came to the Caribbean as indentured laborers historically. You have Indians that came to the Caribbean as indentured laborers historically.
Yes.
Africans came, we know where Africans came. And so you have that mixture, you have that blend of Asians and Africans in the Caribbean who have intermarried, produced, would you like to get some water? Who have intermarried and produced a Caribbean person, right? We don't have that same cultural relationship with North America and Europe.
And you made some very valid points. I don't have a problem with China investing in the Caribbean because it's still a developing country. And from that perspective, we have shared interests because they're a developing country. Because they're still seen as not as developed as they can be, but they're emerging still, they're coming out, and I think it might be in the Caribbean's best interest to be associated with a country that's still growing and emerging than to be associated with countries that have stagnated somewhat.
Well, it seems though, Mrs. Ambrose, that whatever China's interest is, it seems as though they are willing to give more when they are investing than the North Americans and the Europeans.
I think part of the hesitation with China is because you also have another developing territory which competes, which does not have a good relationship with China, and that's Taiwan. That relationship is somewhat, hopefully, going to be mending since they had recent elections there with a new president who says that he will be pursuing that relationship, trying to make it a much better relationship as much as possible. That's one of his first mandates. But there was basically competition between China and Taiwan to see who could get investments in what particular areas. In fact, that competition has been the debase of many political campaigns and elections within the Caribbean.
Well, let's look at trade, for example. When everything you buy from the United States is made in China, right? Aren't we paying double and triple for those products?
Technically, yes.
And if we were buying them directly from China, wouldn't it help to reduce our cost of living? So from that perspective alone, shouldn't we embrace China, who is also a member of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states?
Yeah. So that's what I said. We have shared similarities with China, as you say, more so than the other developed countries are. So I'm not one of those who are against trading with China. I think, however, we have to be a little careful with that because you don't want it to become so overwhelming that technically China owns the Caribbean.
Well, who owns the Caribbean now? I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you said that. Who owns the Caribbean now? Isn't it North America? Isn't it North America and Europe who owns the Caribbean now?
Technically, yeah.
Well, me personally, I prefer that China own it. If it's going to be owned, if it's not going to be owned by Caribbean people, to me, I am more culturally compatible with China, with Asia. You know, so and it seems as though we like to give North America and Europe preference, and I don't know why.
And I think that's basically perception that they're better. And that they're the ideals. We've created them, we've made them ideals, so you want to be associated with quote unquote the best.
I was listening to the news and you're gonna soon find it here. I was listening to the news this afternoon, the Caribbean news before the local news, and there's the conference with help me remember, where you have England want to form a new partnership with the Caribbean region. It's going on right now. I think it's in St. Lucia, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
But you know, one of the issues on the table is the airline tax. You know that. That's the correct term, right? I think it's the airline tax, where you have where Britain is charging all this money in taxes to tourists that's coming to the Caribbean, disproportionately to the rest of the world. And particularly in regards to distance. So now here you have a European country in Great Britain trying to establish a good partnership, working relations with the Caribbean on the one hand, and then on the other hand, they strangling their most important, vital economic sector. How does and one of the Caribbean leaders was drawing it to the attention of the person that's reporting. So how does that how does a relationship work? You know, I mean, historically it seemed as though that our relationship with Europe and North America has been either one of colonialism, one of slavery, one of the transatlantic slave trade, one of racism, one of oppression, one of plantation era, or one of just taking our resources and making
or displacing us
or making themselves rich. We don't have that history. We don't have that history in Asia.
Well, we don't. But I'm just saying that when you've been bitten by one association, it's always to be not necessarily saying that the other associations will follow suit, but just to be a little mindful and be careful about that. But I agree with you that we've always had that bittersweet relationship. It's sweet on one hand and bitter on the other, and that goes right back to slavery. That goes right back to, if you want for a more recent form of colonialism, is what we call neocolonialism, where the American ideals are sold to us wholesale, and we buy into them, and we automatically want everything that America has, and so on, not recognizing that the things that they necessarily engage in are not necessarily culturally compatible with our way of doing things here, and can create various problems, social problems, for example, crime, etc. So you see a lot of their behavior patterns and so on being exhibited throughout the region, and it's because it's being sold through the little TV, the little box that's in our house, our houses, and so on.
Certainly, in there's strength in unity, and the Virgin Islands, from your perspective, needs to embrace CARICOM and needs to be a part of that whole union, and the leadership of these various countries need to get together and make this thing work. You think it has that much value in this global economy where Europe and North America in particular have global domination designs. You know, it's just obvious that that's their plan. Is how important is it in that context, in that global context?
I think it's important to have strength in numbers, but I would say that I think the Virgin Islands is much more comfortable with associating with the OECS. And I want to bring that point up because the OECS is also a regional grouping. And if you look at the makeup of the OECS, it is true what we call true small islands. So the bigger islands like Jamaica, they're not in OECS. So I feel that the Virgin Islands technically is more comfortable associating with those small islands because of size. But yes, there are benefits. But again, the association of the BVR, the Virgin Islands, has to be careful as well because remember, you're still a British overseas territory. And so that is a restriction in itself of how far you can be associated. So, but as I would make the point here that there's nothing wrong with association. As long as the association brings merit and benefits. All right, you don't want to just say, well, I'm an associated member and then there's nothing happening. You need to make sure that something is happening from that association.
Should the OECS also be a part of CARICOM and make it one?
Well, technically, they are in itself. I would make the argument, say they are a separate.
They seem to be going ahead though in doing their own thing.
Yeah,
and have a better success rate than CARICOM.
Yeah,
but
they are, and that's why it is so baffling as to why CARICOM is stumbling, because the same people who are in the OECS are part of CARICOM, and if they can have OECS be able to move forward and have these success stories, why not, expand it over and say to the larger islands, look, we are doing this thing already, come join us. But again, I think that is part of the problem too, because there's this mentality, small island, bigger islands. Bigger islands will have greater advantages than small islands, hence some of the hesitation that takes place within the CARICOM grouping.
We finally turning the clock.
Well,
yes.
Time always runs out.
It always runs out. Well, how can someone who wants to read your paper get a hold of it?
Well, they can contact me. Everyone knows where to find me, but I also have a website, www.dlambrose.org, and that website houses all of the research that I would have done. Right now, I don't have the actual paper physically there, and the reason for that is because it's published by David Publishing. So I'm just waiting for them to make this available online, and then I can connect the link directly to my website and have that available there. But anyone can contact me and have access to this paper and any other
and they can contact you at the HNSCC.
Yeah.
I just got a latex quickly before we go. Can the BVI government make agreements with CARICOM without the UK permission?
I would make the statement that technically they shouldn't. They shouldn't, because you're still being governed technically, overseen by them.
We're still a colony.
Yeah. But there are softer agreements and arrangements that you can be made. And it's those softer agreements that I would, so for example, something like CSME, they would need to go through UK for that. But there's softer agreements that can be made. So there's nothing saying that the Virgin Islands cannot have some trade facilitated between itself and Dominica. There's nothing saying that.
But we have been having
Yeah.
skills coming in with skills transfer from the Caribbean, engineers coming, fixing, doing things.
And that's already in motion.
Yeah.
So that's why I said, I would say that CARICOM is in motion silently in all of the Caribbean countries. It's just that people have not come to grips to recognize that, well, this thing is working, you know.
It's happening with or without us.
Yeah, it is happening. And I think we just have to recognize that if we really seriously talking about moving forward and getting to really position ourselves globally as competitive, you're going to have to seriously look at this model, this CARICOM model, and say, look, it's there, what can we do to fix it? And get it up and running and make it as powerful as possible.
Ms. Dana Lewis Ambrose, thank you very much for being my guest again.
No problem.
And I'm looking forward to having you to talk about the conference, the 2012 conference that's coming up.
Yes.
So we're gonna do this again soon. So.
And I'll bring along my team.
Yes. Congratulations on your publications and your paper, and continued success. All the best to you.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for watching. Thanks for your words of encouragement, your suggestions, and criticisms. Continue to email me at jtvspotlight@yahoo.com. I'm Ed Juenka, reminding you that when the spotlight is on, you see the facts. Peace and blessings.
This program is sponsored by the law firm of J.S. Archibald & Co. and by the trust company J.S. Archibald Trust Services Limited, both of Roadtown, Tortola, BVI.